You can't mourn a monster even if he's your brother. People tell you what grief is supposed to feel like. A weight, a hollowness, a sudden, sharp intake of breath when you forget they're gone, just for a second. They don't have a word for the feeling you get when you read the obituary of the man who destroyed you. It isn't grief, it's stillness. A quiet final balancing of the scales. When I heard that Michael was dead, I didn't cry. I made coffee. And I sat at this table, the last piece of furniture I still have from our father's workshop, and I thought about the beginning. Not the beginning of the end, just the beginning. Before he was a monster, he was my brother. We grew up breathing the scent of cedar and lacquer. Our lullabies were the hum of the bandsaw and the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane over raw timber. Our father, Thomas Sterling, wasn't just a carpenter. He was an artist. He believed furniture had a soul. That a chair wasn't just for sitting. It was for holding you after a long day. A table wasn't just for eating. It was for gathering the people you loved. He called his business Sterling and Sterling. One for him, and one for the future he imagined for us. I was the quiet one. I loved the wood itself. The grain, the imperfections, the way a knot in a plank of oak told a story of a long-forgotten storm. I spent my days in the workshop with Dad, learning the craft. My hands were always nicked, my fingernails permanently lined with dust. I learned how to join dovetails so perfectly they looked like they'd grown together. I learned that patience and integrity were the most important tools in the shop. Dad used to say, "Jessica, you have honest hands. You build things to last, Michael." Michael never had the patience for the work. He had the vision, or that's what he called it. He didn't see the wood. He saw the showroom. He saw the magazine spreads, the glossy photos, the price tags. He didn't smell the sawdust. He smelled the money. He could talk anyone into anything. While I was learning how to build the furniture, he was learning how to sell it. He'd take Dad's designs, sketch a slightly sleeker version, and call it an innovation. "We're not just selling chairs, Dad," he'd say, even at 15. "We're selling a lifestyle. We're selling Sterling." Our father saw it as a perfect partnership. The craftsman and the showman. The soul and the voice. For a long time, so did I. When Dad passed away, we inherited the business 50-50. It felt right. Sacred, even. We were going to carry the torch. I would run the workshop, ensure the quality, uphold the legacy. Michael would handle sales, marketing, the entire front office. He'd wear the tailored suits and charm the clients, and I'd wear my leather apron and make sure what he was selling was the real thing. My life was simple, and it was good. I had my work, which I loved. It was my identity. I was Thomas Sterling's daughter, and I built things that lasted. My evenings were quiet. A book, a glass of wine, the company of a few good friends who didn't mind if I smelled faintly of wood varnish. I wasn't ambitious in the way Michael was. I didn't crave the spotlight. My dream was to see Sterling and Sterling celebrated in 100 years, a quiet hallmark of quality, just like my father had wanted. I felt grounded, stable. I believed in the sturdiness of the world I had built, both inside the workshop and out. I believed in my brother. That was my first and greatest mistake. The change was gradual. So gradual I barely noticed it. At first it was small things. New accountants recommended by Michael who used jargon I didn't understand. Board meetings filled with charts and projections that seemed disconnected from the reality of the workshop floor. Michael would pat my shoulder and say, "Don't you worry about the numbers, Jessie. You just keep making the magic. Leave the boring stuff to me." And I did. I trusted him. He was my brother. Why wouldn't I? He started talking about expansion. Aggressive growth. Franchising the Sterling name. He brought in new investors, sleek, hungry people with cold eyes who looked at our father's designs and saw product lines and marketable assets. I raised concerns. I said that quality would suffer, that the soul of the company was in its craftsmanship, not its logo. He'd listen patiently, his face a perfect mask of concern, and then he would explain, as if to a child, that the world had changed. That legacy didn't pay the bills. "We're a brand now, Jessica. he told me during one late-night argument in his glass-walled office. Brands have to evolve or they die. I didn't know it then, but he wasn't just evolving the brand. He was gutting it. He was using the Sterling and Sterling name, our father's name, my name, as collateral for a series of massive, high-risk loans. He was creating shell corporations, moving money around in a dizzying shell game I couldn't follow. The profit charts he was showing me in those meetings, they were fiction. A beautiful, intricate lie designed to keep me docile in my workshop while he bled our family's legacy dry. The end came suddenly, a house of cards collapsing in a single breath. It started with a phone call from a supplier, a friendly one, a man I'd known for 20 years. His voice was tight with embarrassment. He said our account was frozen. 6 months of unpaid invoices. I told him it was a mistake that I'd sorted out. I went to Michael's office, but he was gone. On a business trip, his assistant said, unable to meet my eyes. Then the calls started coming in floods. Creditors, lenders, the bank. They weren't calling the business. They were calling me, personally. Michael, in his infinite wisdom, had restructured the company. He had created a new parent corporation for all his innovative ventures. Sterling and Sterling, the original workshop, was now a subsidiary. And he had, through a series of documents I had no memory of signing, made me the sole director and personal guarantor for all of its debt. He had been planning it for years. Every document he'd slid across his desk for me to sign, supply orders, payroll authorizations, partnership agreements, had a counterpart. A forgery with my name on a personal guarantee. A counterfeit resolution naming me the officer responsible for the company's finances. He had built a fortress of paper around himself, and a prison of paper around me. He sold off the company's most valuable assets, our father's designs, the brand name, our client list, to one of the new investors, who was, of course, a front for Michael's new corporation. The sale price was laughably low, just enough to cover the debts of his parent company, not the workshop. Then he declared Sterling and Sterling bankrupt. I lost everything in 48 hours. The workshop, our father's legacy, was shuttered, its doors chained by the bank. My employees, people I'd known my whole life, were laid off. My home, which had been in our family for generations, was seized as an asset. My savings were drained by legal fees. The news articles called it a simple business failure. A classic case of a heritage brand failing to adapt. Some even hinted it was my fault. Sources close to the company suggest Jessica Sterling lacked the business acumen of her visionary brother, Michael. He had even prepared the narrative for my failure. The system, I learned, is not designed to find the truth. It's designed to find the path of least resistance. I hired a lawyer, a good one, a man who seemed genuinely outraged. We filed a lawsuit, fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty. We went to discovery. Michael's lawyers buried us in paperwork. 1,000 pages to hide one. They painted me as incompetent, a bitter artist who was jealous of her brother's success. They claimed I was the one who had mismanaged the finances, and this lawsuit was a desperate attempt to shift the blame. And the forgeries, they were perfect. Michael had practiced my signature for years. On memos, on birthday cards, on little notes left on my desk. He'd been rehearsing for his final performance. Experts were divided. The paper trail he'd created was a masterpiece of misdirection. Every forged signature was attached to a document that seemed plausible for me to have signed. It was my word against his, the craftsman against the showman. And in a courtroom, the better story always wins. His deposition was the moment I understood what I was truly up against. He sat across the table, dressed in a somber navy suit, his face a mask of sorrowful regret. He looked at me, his eyes full of feigned pity, and he lied. He lied with such ease, such conviction, that for a terrifying second, even I almost believed him. He spoke of how he'd tried to save the company, how he'd tried to protect me from my own financial naivete. He twisted every memory, every conversation into a weapon against me. He told them about the night I'd cried in his office, terrified of the numbers. He presented it as proof of my incompetence. He neglected to mention that I was crying because our father had just passed away a week earlier. He used our shared grief as a tool to discredit me. That was the moment the last shred of the brother I knew died. In his place was a stranger, a brilliant, charming, utterly soulless monster who had worn my brother's face my entire life. The judge dismissed the case. A family squabble, he called it. A business dispute with insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed. It protected the man with the better story, the better lawyers, the better lies. It protected the powerful. It crushed the one who told the truth. I spent the next year in a daze, working dead-end jobs to pay off debts that would follow me for the rest of my life. Renting a tiny apartment in a part of the city I never knew existed. I was haunted by the ghosts of what I'd lost. The smell of sawdust, the weight of my father's tools in my hand, the pride in my own name. I was a Sterling, and the name meant nothing now. Worse than nothing. It meant failure. Meanwhile, Michael was on the cover of magazines. Michael Sterling, the visionary CEO of Ethel, is redefining modern luxury. Ethel. He'd even stolen the name from an old book on Anglo-Saxon woodworking our father had loved. He was living my life, the one he'd stolen, and he was being celebrated for it. He would give interviews and talk about the importance of family, of legacy, and he would smile. That perfect, empty salesman's smile. I watched him from the shadows. I read every article. I followed his company's stock prices. I learned the names of his new board members, his investors, his wife. I lived in a world of gray, and he lived in a world of brilliant, shining color. The law had given its verdict. Society had given its verdict. They had declared him the winner. And one night sitting here in this room, reading about a new philanthropic award he'd been given, something inside me shifted. The grief didn't disappear. The anger didn't vanish. But they cooled. They condensed. They solidified into something new. Something hard and clear and sharp. It was the realization that justice isn't a thing the world gives you. It's a thing you take. The world had heard Michael's story. It was a good one, plausible, polished, but it was fiction. I decided it was time for the world to hear the truth. Not my version. The version? Michael built his empire on a foundation of lies. A structure made of paper and deceit. I, on the other hand, am my father's daughter. I build things to last. And I know that even the most impressive structure can be brought down, piece by piece, if you know exactly where to apply the pressure. The courts were closed. The legal system was done with us. But I wasn't. He thought he had taken everything. He was wrong. He left me with my name. And he left me with my mind. A mind that now had only one single, solitary purpose. He wrote the first chapter. I would write the last. The law had failed. So I would become the law. Justice had been denied. So I would become the justice. Michael Sterling, the visionary, had no idea what was coming. He had forgotten one simple thing he learned in our father's workshop. I'm the one who knows how things are built. And I'm the one who knows how they come apart. He built a prison of paper to trap me, and for a year I lived in it. But I finally realized that every prison has a blueprint. And every blueprint has a flaw. It was time to stop reading his story and start designing my own. He was my brother. We built a life on our father's legacy, but he saw it as a ladder. While I was in the workshop, honoring our name, he was in the boardroom, leveraging it. He buried me in paper, forged my signature, and engineered the collapse of everything we had, pinning the blame and the debt squarely on me. The law sided with the better liar. He walked away with a new company, a celebrated name, and our father's stolen dreams, while I was left with nothing but the ruins. But he made a mistake. He thought the story was over. He didn't realize that in all the wreckage, he'd left me with a foundation for something new, a purpose. The courts were done, but I was just beginning. Revenge isn't a single act of violence, a swing of an axe. That's clumsy, emotional. My father taught me that the finest work requires patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of the material. Michael was now my material. I spent the first 6 months not acting, but studying. I didn't want to just hurt him. I wanted to deconstruct him. I wanted to take him apart with the same meticulous care I would use to disassemble a priceless antique. My days, once filled with the scent of wood, now smelled of old paper and lukewarm coffee. I worked 2 jobs, a barista from 5 in the morning until noon, and a data entry clerk from 1 until 6. The jobs were mindless, anonymous. They paid for my rent, my food, and my real work, which began at night. My tiny apartment became a university of one. My curriculum was Michael Sterling. I devoured books on forensic accounting until I could read a balance sheet like a poem, finding the hidden rhymes of fraud and deceit. I taught myself the basics of cybersecurity, not to become some master hacker, but to understand the digital ghosts we all leave behind. I learned how data flowed, how servers talked, and how even the most secure man in the world leaves a trail of breadcrumbs. I became a scholar of my brother's life. I knew what time he arrived at the office, the name of the woman he bought his coffee from, the brand of his tailored suits. I knew his public persona, the charismatic innovator, the family man, the philanthropist. But I was looking for the man behind the mask, the one only I had ever truly seen. My first attempts were failures. Clumsy. I found the name of a former partner Michael had pushed out of Ethel in its early days. A man named David Chen. I thought I'd found an ally. I created a burner email account and sent a message hinting at shared grievances. It was a mistake. 2 days later, a cease and desist letter from Ethel's legal team arrived at the P.O. box I'd foolishly rented in my own neighborhood. Michael's paranoia was a fortress, and his lawyers were the guards. He had inspired fear, and fear breeds a loyalty of its own. I had tried to knock on the front door, and he'd answered with a cannon. The lesson was clear. I could never be seen. I had to become a ghost, a whisper in the walls of his life. So I changed my approach. I couldn't attack the fortress. I had to poison the well. Michael's strength was his image, the ecosystem of trust and admiration he'd built around himself. His board of directors, his investors, his wife, they were all pillars holding him up. My goal was to introduce termites. Tiny, invisible doubts that would eat away at the foundations until the whole thing came crashing down. My first target was his wife, Eleanor. From everything I could find, she was a good person, a society fundraiser from old money who genuinely believed in the myth of Michael Sterling. She was also the keeper of his social calendar, the guarantor of his public image as a devoted husband. Destroying their marriage wasn't the goal. Making it a liability was I knew Michael wasn't faithful. It wasn't in his nature. He craved adoration from every direction. I spent weeks cross-referencing his travel schedules with social media posts, looking for patterns. I found one. A young marketing assistant at his firm. Her Instagram told a story of sudden, lavish gifts and weekend trips to cities where Michael just happened to have business. I didn't need to prove it. I just needed to plant a seed. I went to a flea market and found an antique silver locket, the kind of thing my father would have loved for its quiet elegance. I put it in a gift box from a boutique Eleanor frequented, and I sent it to their home via courier with a simple, unsigned, typewritten note, "For everything you've forgotten." It was perfect in its ambiguity. Was it from a forgotten friend, a secret admirer, or a mistress reminding Michael of a promise he'd made? I didn't know what would happen, but I knew Eleanor would look at her husband a little differently that night. And a man like Michael, a man who relies on unquestioning adoration, would feel that shift. He would feel the chill. The next pillar was his board, specifically a man named Robert Wexler, the cautious, old money investor who chaired the audit committee. Wexler wasn't a visionary. He was a pragmatist. He cared about stability and his reputation. I knew from my father that Wexler's firm had a history of dropping clients at the first sign of scandal. He was a man who hated surprises, so I decided to give him one. This time, I was more careful. I went to a public library across the city. Using their computers, I created another anonymous email. I didn't make accusations. I simply asked a question. The email sent to Wexler's private account read, Ask Michael about the discrepancies in the Q3 logistics reports from the Warsaw facility. The shipping manifests don't match the declared inventory. I had no idea if there were discrepancies. But Warsaw was a new, expensive acquisition for Ethel, a project Michael had championed. By making my lie specific, I made it plausible. It was a detail a disgruntled employee might leak. Wexler wouldn't ignore it. A man like him couldn't afford to. He wouldn't accuse Michael, not at first. But he would start watching. He would start double-checking the numbers. The trust would be fractured, replaced by the quiet hum of suspicion. These were small things. Ghost pains. But they began to have an effect. I monitored Ethel's internal communications through publicly available information, press releases, investor calls, metadata on their website. The language started to change. Words like streamlining and internal review began to appear. Michael, who was used to a world that bent to his will, was now dealing with friction. A questioning wife. A watchful board. Whispers he couldn't trace. His fortress was no longer serene. I was getting bolder, more confident. I had built a new identity online, a freelance financial journalist named Leo Hauser. I created a backstory, a portfolio of generic articles, a plausible digital footprint. Leo's specialty was supply chain logistics in Eastern Europe. It gave me a legitimate reason to be asking questions about companies like Ethel. It was under this guise that I stumbled upon the twist. The piece of information that changed the entire game. The midpoint revelation. I was digging into Ethel's genesis, trying to find the source of the seed money Michael had used to launch it after bankrupting Sterling and Sterling. It was supposed to have come from a consortium of venture capitalists. That was the public story. But as I peeled back the layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts, a process that took me months, I found a name that didn't belong. A single massive wire transfer from a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. A company owned by a man named Julian Croft. The name sent a chill down my spine. Julian Croft wasn't just another investor. He was a ghost in the corporate world, a ruthless asset stripper known for hostile takeovers. He operated in the shadows, his name never appearing on official documents, but his reputation was the stuff of legend on Wall Street. He was violent, unforgiving, and utterly invisible. He was the kind of man you made a deal with, but you never, ever crossed. And Michael, in his arrogance, had crossed him. As I dug deeper, the picture became horrifyingly clear. Croft had been the primary source of Michael's seed money. It wasn't an investment. It was a leash. But Michael had used his mastery of corporate law to outmaneuver him. Through a series of brilliant, fraudulent maneuvers, he had diluted Croft's shares to worthlessness and locked him out of the company he had funded, effectively stealing millions from one of the most dangerous men in the world. Michael hadn't just built his company on my family's ruins. He'd built it with a mobster's money and then stolen it a second time. This changed everything. My plan to slowly dismantle Michael's life suddenly felt like a child's game. I had been planning to burn down his house, not realizing it was built on top of an ammunition dump. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. Michael's secret wasn't just a weakness. It was a self-destruct button. If Croft ever found out what Michael had done... For a week, I did nothing. The weight of the secret was suffocating. I had the power to utterly destroy Michael, to hand him over to a man who would do far, far worse than bankrupt him. Was that what I wanted? Was that justice? The line I was walking, already blurry, now seemed to vanish entirely. But then I saw a new interview with Michael. He was announcing the Thomas Sterling Grant for Young Artisans, a charitable foundation in our father's name. He stood at a podium, his face radiating benevolence, and he talked about integrity. He talked about legacy. He used our father's memory as the final shimmering coat of varnish on his masterpiece of lies. And in that moment, the doubt vanished. He was a cancer, and you don't reason with a cancer. You cut it out, whatever the cost. My revenge had to escalate. It needed a new vector. Croft was too dangerous to contact directly, but the knowledge of Croft was a weapon. I had to use it to spook Michael's inner circle, to make them see that the ship they were on was captained by a madman. My target was Daniel Cartwright, Michael's COO and his right-hand man. Cartwright was ambitious, smart, and utterly unsentimental. His loyalty was to success, not to Michael. I needed to show him that Michael was no longer a winning horse to bet on. I began feeding information to my Leo Hauser persona, writing an article for a niche financial blog about anonymous risk in tech startups. It was dry, academic, but it contained a single explosive paragraph detailing, hypothetically, how a CEO could use offshore transfers to defraud a silent partner. I didn't name Michael or Ethel or Croft. I didn't have to. I sent the link to Cartwright from my Leo Hauser email with a simple message. Thought you might find this relevant to our previous conversations about Ethel's creative financing. I'd never had any conversations with him, of course. But the bluff, combined with the unnerving accuracy of the article, would be enough to ignite his paranoia. It worked. Too well, Ethel's stock stuttered. The board called an emergency meeting. The well-oiled machine of Michael's life began to seize and grind. But I had underestimated his desperation. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. He didn't know who was attacking him or from where, but he knew there was a traitor. And he reacted not by shoring up his defenses, but by lashing out. He hired a private security firm, a Black Ops corporate intelligence group, to find the source of the leaks. To find me, this was my low point. The moment my carefully constructed world began to fray, one of the barista colleagues at my morning job mentioned that a man in a suit had been in, asking questions about me. Showing my photo. My blood ran cold. I quit that day. The data entry job followed. The investigator was good. He'd traced the P.O. box from my first clumsy attempt with David Chen. He was building a profile. He was getting closer. I had to erase myself. I wiped my devices, shut down my fake accounts, and for 2 weeks, I lived like a fugitive in my own apartment. The thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by a gnawing, constant fear. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, certain I could hear footsteps in the hall. Every siren seemed to be for me. I had set out to dismantle Michael's life, but I was dismantling my own in the process. I was becoming a ghost, a collection of secrets and lies just like him. I looked in the mirror one morning and saw the same haunted, paranoid eyes I imagined he now had. The thought was sickening. Was this victory? To become a mirror image of the monster I was trying to destroy? I had lost everything once because of him. Now I was losing myself. And for what? For a victory no one would ever see? I was on the verge of breaking, of running, packing a single bag and disappearing, leaving him to his gilded cage and his secret demons. It would be so easy. Just stop. Let it go. Let him win. But then I thought of my father. I thought of his honest hands. I thought of his belief that you build things to last. Michael's entire world was a cheap imitation, a veneer of success hiding a rotten core. And I remembered the most important lesson from the workshop. You don't leave a job half-finished. I had stripped away the varnish. I had exposed the cheap particle board underneath. Now it was time to set it on fire. The fear wasn't gone, but my purpose was stronger. I had one card left to play, the most dangerous card in the deck. Julian Croft, I couldn't give up. Not when I was one move away from checkmate. I had become a ghost, haunted by the fear of being caught and the person I was becoming. But there is a clarity in hitting rock bottom. I realized I had nothing left to lose, and he still had everything. It was no longer about a slow demolition. It was time to light the fuse. I became a ghost. I poisoned the wells of my brother's perfect life with whispers and doubts, turning his wife and his board against him with tiny, untraceable truths. But in my search for leverage, I stumbled upon a secret far more dangerous than his betrayal of me. He had cheated a ruthless man named Julian Croft, building his new empire on stolen mob money. My private war for justice had wandered onto a battlefield I never intended to enter. Michael, feeling the pressure, hunted for the source of his misfortune. His investigators got close, forcing me into the shadows, making me question the person I was becoming in my pursuit of him. For a moment, I almost ran. but you don't leave a job half-finished. I had his self-destruct button in my hand. It was time to press it. There's a strange peace that comes after you've accepted the worst possible outcome. Once you've looked into the abyss and said, "Fine, let's do this," fear loses its power. It's no longer a predator hunting you in the dark. It becomes a tool, a whetstone to sharpen your focus. I was done being a ghost. I was done hiding. The final act of this story wouldn't be written from the shadows. It would be written in blazing light on the biggest stage Michael had ever built for himself. My plan solidified with absolute clarity. It would be a piece of theater, a tragedy in 3 acts performed in a single night. The venue, the Ethel Annual Innovation Gala, a grand, self-congratulatory affair where Michael would be the star, accepting an award and giving the keynote address to hundreds of investors, journalists, and employees. It was the apotheosis of his stolen life. It would also be the site of its public execution. I couldn't just send the information about Julian Croft to the authorities or the press. Men like Croft have ways of burying stories and the people who tell them. And Michael was a master of spinning narratives. No, the truth had to detonate in a way that was instantaneous, undeniable, and inescapable. It had to happen while he was live on stage with the entire financial world watching. For 3 weeks I worked. I gathered every piece of evidence, the forged documents from the Sterling & Sterling bankruptcy, the offshore wire transfers from Croft's holding company, the labyrinthine corporate structure Michael had designed to lock Croft out. I compiled it all into a single devastating narrative under my Leo Hauser persona. It was the best, most truthful thing I had ever written. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a meticulous prosecution complete with exhibits and a clear, damning timeline. I uploaded the entire file to a dozen different encrypted decentralized servers, the kind that couldn't be shut down. Then I arranged for my own access to the Gala. It was surprisingly easy. People who build fortresses of security are always worried about attacks from the outside. They never think to check the people already inside. I got a job with the catering company hired for the event. A black uniform, a white apron, and a name tag that said Maria. I would be a server. Completely invisible. I would be standing in the room when his world ended. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to watch the mask fall. The night of the gala was cold and clear. The venue was a modern art museum, all glass and steel, a perfect metaphor for Michael's hollow empire. I spent the first few hours carrying trays of champagne and tiny, elaborate appetizers. I moved through crowds of people I once knew, old family friends who had sided with him, former clients who believed his lies. None of them recognized me. Why would they? I was just part of the scenery. I saw his wife Eleanor looking radiant, but with a tightness around her eyes I recognized. I saw Robert Wexler and Daniel Cartwright laughing and shaking hands, the perfect picture of corporate loyalty. And then I saw him. He was incandescent, drunk on his own success. He moved through the room not like a man, but like a gravitational force, pulling everyone into his orbit. He was wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my apartment. His smile was blinding, and his confidence was absolute. He was a king in his court, and I was the ghost at the feast. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, just the brief, dismissive glance a man like him gives to a servant. It was perfect. At 9 p.m., the presentations began. I slipped away to a small service corridor, my heart a steady, cold drum in my chest. I took out a small burner phone. At 9:15, as the company's CFO was droning on about record-breaking profits, I pressed send on a series of timed, pre-written emails. One went to every major financial news desk in the country. Another went to the personal accounts of Wexler, Cartwright, and every member of Ethel's board. A third went to a known legal representative of Julian Croft's legitimate business front. Each email was simple. It contained no text, just a single link to the Leo Hauser exposé, which had just gone live. The fuse was lit. I returned to the hall just as Michael was being introduced. The applause was thunderous. He walked onto the stage, waving, soaking in the adoration. He strode to the podium, a massive screen behind him displaying the Ethel logo. He looked out at the audience, at his empire, and he began to speak. Legacy, he started, his voice resonating through the hall. It's a word we hear a lot. But what does it truly mean? It means building something that lasts. Something that stands for integrity, for vision, for a better future. I wasn't watching him. I was watching them. I saw the first phone light up. It was Robert Wexler. He frowned, tapped the screen. His eyes widened slightly. He scrolled. Then his face, a mask of polite interest just moments before, turned the color of ash. He discreetly nudged the man next to him. Another phone lit up. Then another. And another. A silent digital plague was spreading through the room. Michael sensed it first as a change in the atmosphere. The focused silence of the room was gone, replaced by a low, anxious murmur. A few people stood up and hurried toward the exits. His smile tightened. He raised his voice slightly, trying to recapture their attention. Our success is built on a foundation of trust. That's when Daniel Cartwright, his ambitious COO, stood up. He didn't look at Michael. He looked at Wexler, gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and walked briskly out of the room. That was the signal. The dam had broken. Someone in the tech booth, I don't know who, a panicked board member, a journalist, it doesn't matter, projected the article onto the massive screen behind Michael. The Ethel logo vanished, replaced by the stark, black and white headline, "The Architect of Deceit, How Michael Sterling Built an Empire on a Foundation of Fraud." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. For a full 10 seconds, Michael just stood there, exposed. The visionary, the innovator, the charismatic leader, he was gone. All that was left was a small, terrified man in an expensive suit, staring at his own ruin. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The mask didn't just fall. It shattered into a million pieces. He looked out at the sea of faces, no longer looking at him with adoration, but with contempt, with pity, with disgust. He was looking for an ally, for a friendly face, for anyone. And he found no one. Finally, his eyes found me. I was still standing by the back wall, holding my empty tray. And in that moment, I let him see. I dropped the anonymous, vacant expression of Maria, the server, and I looked at him. Just looked. He saw me, and he knew. The blood drained from his face. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of pure, unadulterated comprehension. He finally understood. Security guards, directed by a frantic-looking Wexler, were moving toward the stage. Not to protect him. To remove him. He stumbled back from the podium, turned, and was escorted off the stage like a common criminal. The king had been deposed. I set my tray down on a table, walked out of the service exit, and into the cold night air. I didn't look back. The fallout was biblical. The SEC froze Ethel's assets. The board resigned. The company was dismantled for parts within 6 months. Michael was, of course, publicly disavowed by everyone who had ever shaken his hand. He was facing decades in prison for securities fraud alone. But he never went to trial. About 3 weeks after the gala, he disappeared. His car was found near a private airfield outside the city. There was no note. No sign of a struggle. He was just gone. The police officially listed him as a missing person, a fugitive from justice. But I know the truth. Julian Croft is not a man who involves the police. He is a man who tidies his own loose ends. Michael Sterling wasn't a fugitive. He was a debt collected in full, and me. I watched it all from a distance. I read the articles, I saw the news reports, and I felt nothing. The fire of my revenge, the inferno that had consumed me for years, had burned itself out. And in its place, there was only a profound, echoing quiet. A stillness. So, the question everyone asks, the one I have asked myself 1,000 times in this quiet room, was it worth it? I avenged my father. I exposed the truth. I stopped a monster who would have gone on to ruin countless other lives. On that ledger, the answer is yes. Justice was done. Not the clean, sanitized justice of a courtroom, but something more primal. More absolute. But did it bring me peace? Did it heal the wound? Did it give me back the life he stole? No. The girl who loved the smell of sawdust, who believed in the honesty of her own hands, she's gone. I traded her for the woman who could orchestrate a man's destruction. To fight the monster, I had to build a labyrinth in my own soul. I had to learn the language of lies and deceit. I had to become a reflection of the thing I hated most. He took my past and my future. And my revenge. My revenge took my present. It consumed me. And now that it's over, I have to learn how to live in the silence. I didn't get my life back. I don't know if I ever will. But I got my name back, Sterling. It no longer means failure. It no longer means victim. It means I survived. And maybe in the end, that's the only victory that matters.